The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and heat. Private Hiroshi Nakamura drifted upwards from a black, formless void, expecting nothing. The machine gun burst that had torn through his squad on the beach, the searing pain, the taste of salt and copper. That should have been his ending. Quick, clean, honourable. A final thought for his mother's face, then the silence of the imperial shrine. Instead, a dull, throbbing ache in his shoulder anchored him to a world of sensation. A white, oppressive light filtered through canvas walls above him. The air hummed with a low, distant murmur of voices and machinery. This was not darkness. This was not oblivion. He was breathing. The realization was a betrayal. A shadow moved beside his cot. Nakamura tensed, every muscle coiling. His training screamed at him interrogation, torture, a final humiliation at the hands of the barbarians. He prepared his mind, building the walls, steeling himself for the blow, the insult, the cold finality of an executioner's bullet. Then, a cool hand touched his forehead. It was a gentle, professional touch, but to Hiroshi, it felt like a bolt of lightning. A woman's voice spoke, soft and incomprehensible. The words were English, a language he knew only as the harsh bark of commands or the screams of battle. He forced his eyes open fully, blinking against the glare. The figure above him came into focus. She was wearing a clean, crisp uniform, a cap perched on her head. An American nurse. She was adjusting his blanket. Her movements efficient yet gentle, the same care she might show a sleeping child or a beloved brother. The world tilted on its axis. She noticed his open eyes. A small, tired smile touched her lips. She reached for a metal cup on the bedside stand. "Take it easy, soldier," she said, her Japanese heavily accented. Each word carefully chosen and clumsily pronounced. She held the cup to his lips. "You're safe now." The water was cool, a miracle on his parched tongue. He drank, his eyes never leaving her face. This single, simple act of kindness was more devastating than any weapon he had faced on the beach. It violated every assumption, every piece of propaganda he had absorbed since boyhood. The Americans were supposed to be monsters. Brutes who tortured and mutilated their prisoners. They were not supposed to have women like this. Women with calm eyes and gentle hands who offered water and spoke words of reassurance. He lay back, the pillow swallowing his head, his mind reeling. The cultural foundations of his world, so meticulously constructed by his village upbringing and the relentless indoctrination of the military, were cracking. He had never spoken to a foreign woman before. In his world, women were subordinate, separate from the martial affairs of men. They were mothers, sisters, wives, figures of home to be protected, not figures of authority on a battlefield. This nurse, this enemy, wore lieutenant's bars on her uniform. He saw a male orderly pass by and nod to her with respect. She gave a quiet instruction in English, and he moved to obey. She made decisions. She commanded. Her very existence in this place, wielding this authority, was an impossibility that his brain struggled to process. Later that evening, she returned with a cart of medical supplies. Her name, he would learn, was Lieutenant Mary Collins. She moved to check the bandages on his shoulder. A hot spike of shame and defiance shot through him. Honor demanded he refuse. To accept care, especially from a woman of the enemy, was a weakness. It was a violation of the code. He shook his head, a sharp, stiff gesture. "No," he muttered in Japanese, pulling away slightly. She paused, her hands hovering. She didn't understand the word, but she understood the resistance. Her expression didn't change to anger or frustration, only a quiet, professional patience. She met his eyes and slowly, deliberately, pointed to his bandaged shoulder, then to her own eyes, and gave a small, firm shake of her head. The message was clear: this is not a negotiation. This needs to be done. His body betrayed his principles. The wound throbbed insistently, a painful reminder of his vulnerability. Her hands, when they began their work, were skilled and confident. She peeled back the dressing, cleaned the angry, stitched flesh with a practiced touch, and applied a fresh bandage. There was no hesitation, no disgust. It was a job that needed doing, and she did it well. His resistance, in the face of such calm competence, felt not principled, but foolish. He was in Ward 7, a long canvas structure housing 40 beds. As the days passed and the fog of pain and medication lifted, Hiroshi began to observe his surroundings. The ward was a microcosm of the war. There were Americans with limbs in traction, their faces pale but often cheerful. There were other Japanese soldiers, their expressions a mirror of his own confusion. There were even Korean laborers, caught in the middle, and moving between them all, like serene planets in a chaotic universe, were the nurses. Lieutenant Collins was often at the center of it. He watched her one morning as she dealt with a new arrival, a young American Marine screaming in pain from a stomach wound. Her voice was calm, her hands steady as she prepared a syringe of morphine. "Easy, son, easy now. This will help." The Marine gripped her arm, his knuckles white, and she bore it without flinching, speaking to him in a low, soothing monotone until the drug took effect, and he slumped back, panting. An hour later, she was doing the same for a Japanese soldier with a shattered leg, her tone identical, her touch just as gentle. Hiroshi heard her say to a newly arrived, wide-eyed nurse, "A patient is a patient. These men aren't soldiers anymore. They're human beings who need medical care. Politics stops at the hospital door." This philosophy was applied with a systematic kindness that was more disorienting than any cruelty. They had prepared for torture, for humiliation, for a swift and honorable death. They had not prepared for morphine to ease their pain, for clean sheets, for meals that included fruit and even, on one astonishing day, ice cream. The Americans, it seemed, had so much plenty that they could afford to share it with their enemies. It was a concept as alien as the nurse's kindness. The language barrier created a strange, intimate pantomime. Another nurse, a blonde woman named Helen Baker, carried a small, battered notebook. Hiroshi saw her using it with a terrified, looking young private named Kenji Tanaka. She would point to a phrase written in phonetic Japanese. "Miwa, ri, ma, suka," she sounded out, painfully slowly. "Does it hurt?" Tanaka, wide-eyed, just stared. She tried again, then pointed to his bandaged abdomen with a questioning look. He finally gave a slight, hesitant nod. She smiled, a warm, genuine smile that seemed to light up her tired face. "Daijobu desu," she said, her pronunciation truly terrible. "It's okay." It wasn't the words, but the effort that mattered. The attempt to bridge the gap, to communicate care in his own language, conveyed a respect that a professional interpreter could never have matched. A few nights later, Tanaka developed a fever. His shrapnel wounds had become infected. Hiroshi, from his adjacent cot, watched as the young man thrashed and moaned, lost in a delirious haze. Nurse Baker came. She didn't just administer medication and leave. She pulled up a stool, sat beside his cot, and began applying cool, damp cloths to his forehead. She stayed there through the long, dark hours, her presence a silent vigil in the humming quiet of the night ward. She monitored his temperature, spoke soft, meaningless, but meaningful words, and never left his side. In that vulnerable space between waking and nightmare, the enemy ceased to exist. There was only a woman's gentle hand and a boy's burning fever. The officers among the prisoners faced a unique psychological torment. Captain Yoshiaki Sato, a man who had commanded an infantry company for 3 brutal years, now found himself a prisoner with a left leg shattered by an American mortar. The surgeons had saved it, but the path to walking again was long and humiliating. It involved physical therapy administered primarily by women. Captain Sato could not bring himself to look directly at Lieutenant Patricia Wong, the therapist assigned to his case. She was a small, fierce woman who wore the same lieutenant's bars he once commanded respect with. She gave him orders. "Lift your leg, Captain." Again. Higher. Her authority in this medical realm was absolute, and the male orderlies jumped to fulfill her requests. I could not look at them directly. Sato would later confess, the memory still vivid. These women held rank in their military. Some were officers like myself. They gave orders to male subordinates and made decisions about my treatment. Everything I had been taught said this was impossible. Yet, I witnessed it daily. The role reversal was complete and psychologically devastating. He was dependent on Lieutenant Wong for the most basic of functions. Learning to walk again. To use a bedpan, to bathe. She treated his military rank with a cautious but firm indifference, making it clear that in this world, medical authority was the only hierarchy that mattered. When she guided his trembling leg through its exercises, her hands firm and knowing, he experienced a cultural vertigo that was more disabling than the pain in his bones. For the youngest prisoners, the care they received tapped into a deeper, more primal well of emotion. Private Saburo Hayashi was only 19. The chest wound that had nearly killed him required daily dressing changes, an intimate and painful procedure. The nurse who usually performed it was Sarah Mitchell, a woman with kind eyes and a quiet demeanor. She approached her work with a gentle efficiency, but Hayashi interpreted her touch through the lens of a memory long buried by military life. When she smoothed his blanket or adjusted his pillow, her hands were sure and soft. He remembered his mother's hands, tending to him during childhood fevers, her touch the very definition of safety and love. She hummed while working. Hayashi would recall decades later, his voice thick with emotion. American songs I didn't recognize, but the melody was peaceful. It reminded me of my mother singing while she cooked in the kitchen. For a few minutes, lying there in that strange place, I forgot I was a prisoner. I forgot I was a soldier. I felt like a son being cared for by someone who genuinely wanted me to get well. This maternal association created a powerful cognitive dissonance. How could these demonic Americans, these corrupt and weak Westerners, possess such fundamental, motherly instincts? The evidence of his own senses, the feeling of that care, directly contradicted years of ideological conditioning. The propaganda was a brittle shell, and kindness was the hammer slowly tapping it to pieces. The American hospital itself was a revelation of a different kind. The casual abundance of medical technology was staggering to men accustomed to the austerity of the Imperial Japanese Army Medical Corps. X-ray machines, gleaming surgical instruments, whole storerooms of bandages and drugs. The routine use of penicillin, a miracle drug they had only heard whispers of, saved limbs and lives that would have been lost on their own side. Blood transfusions were administered with a matter of factness that seemed almost magical. Anesthesia was used for even minor procedures, eliminating pain that their own doctors would have told them to endure as a test of spirit. This was not just kindness, it was power. An industrial and scientific power so vast that it could be lavished on preserving the lives of its enemies. It spoke of a society that valued human life in a way that was fundamentally different, and in its own way, terrifyingly strong. Hiroshi Nakamura suffered from insomnia. The pain in his shoulder and the tumult in his mind made sleep elusive. During the night shift, a different nurse patrolled the wards. A tall, serious woman named Dorothy Fisher. She noticed his wakefulness, the way he lay rigid in the dim light. She didn't say anything. She simply checked his chart, then went to a supply closet and returned with an extra pillow. She carefully, wordlessly, adjusted his positioning, using the pillows to take the pressure off his wounded shoulder. She adjusted the lantern at the nurse's station so its glow wouldn't shine directly in his eyes. And throughout the night, on her rounds, she would pause by his bed, her presence a silent acknowledgement that he was seen, that his discomfort mattered. She didn't have to do any of that. Nakamura would later write in a letter he knew he could never send. I was just another enemy prisoner, a number, taking up a bed and consuming resources. But she treated me like I mattered, like my comfort was important. That kind of individual attention was something I'd never even received from my own army's medical personnel. These women weren't monsters. They were people. And that was the most frightening realization of all. One day a new nurse appeared on the ward. She was Japanese. The shock that rippled through the Japanese prisoners was palpable. Her name was Lieutenant Grace Yamamoto, and she was a Avnizi, a second-generation Japanese, American. She spoke fluent, beautiful Japanese, her words flowing without the clumsy hesitation of the others. She moved from bed to bed, speaking to the prisoners, understanding their cultural nuances, their unspoken fears. For Captain Sato, her existence was the final, shattering blow to his worldview. How could this be? The propaganda had been unequivocal. Japanese people in America were persecuted, imprisoned, despised. They were not given officers' commissions in the United States Army. They did not wear the uniform with pride and command respect from their white colleagues. Yamamoto arranged for rice to be served when supplies permitted. She understood the deep, seated shame some felt at being captured and offered words that acknowledged their honor as soldiers, not as captives. She was a living, breathing contradiction. She was completely Japanese and completely American, Sato observed, his mind still struggling with the concept. She spoke our language perfectly, understood our customs, our sense of shame, but wore an American uniform and served their military with obvious loyalty and conviction. It forced me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about America. Everything. In the quiet moments, the nurses themselves grappled with their roles. Mary Collins sat at a small desk in the corner of the ward, a piece of V-mail stationery in front of her. She was writing to her sister in Ohio. Dearest Clara, she wrote, her pen moving slowly. The work is endless, and some days the despair in this place is a physical weight. We lost 2 boys today, one from Kansas, one from California. It never gets easier. But what truly haunts me are the others. The Japanese. These Japanese boys are so young, many barely 18 or 19. When they're unconscious from fever or pain medication, they cry out for their mothers in Japanese. Okasan, Okasan. It's the same word, over and over. It breaks your heart, Clara. It just breaks your heart. They're somebody's sons, just like Tom and Billy. The war, the hatred. It all seems very far away when you're changing bandages and seeing how scared and young they are underneath the soldier facade. She put her pen down, looking out over the rows of beds. The war was not far away, not really. Her own brother had been on the Arizona at Pearl Harbor. The anger was there, a cold stone in her gut. But it was hard to hold on to that anger when you were holding the hand of a feverish boy who just wanted his mother. As the weeks turned into months, the initial shock gave way to a fragile routine. For those with severe injuries, rehabilitation began. Sergeant Ichiro Fujita had lost his right arm to an American artillery shell. The stump had healed, but his life had been shattered. He was sullen, withdrawn, his eyes fixed on a future he could no longer see. His physical therapist was Lieutenant Barbara Chen, a woman with boundless patience and a no-nonsense attitude. The rehabilitation process was grueling, a daily battle against frustration and despair. Fujita had to learn everything again. How to dress, how to eat, how to write with his left hand. He would often lapse into furious silence, refusing to cooperate. Lieutenant Chen never scolded him, never showed pity. She simply waited, her calm presence a silent challenge to his self-pity. Again. "Sergeant," she would say, when he failed to button his shirt. "The war took your arm. Don't let it take your will." One day, in a fit of rage, he swept the practice utensils off the table with his left arm. They clattered to the floor. He sat there, chest heaving, humiliated by his own outburst. Lieutenant Chen said nothing. She knelt and began picking up the scattered items. She placed them back on the table in front of him. Then she sat down. "My parents emigrated from China," she said, her voice conversational. "They owned a laundry. Everyone looked down on them, told them what they couldn't do, told me what I couldn't do. They said a Chinese girl couldn't be an officer, couldn't be a therapist." She looked him directly in the eyes. "Limitations are only real if you accept them." Her words, her story, pierced through his wall of anger. She never showed pity or impatience. Fujita recalled years later. "When I became frustrated with my limitations, she remained calm and encouraging. She taught me that losing an arm didn't mean losing dignity or usefulness. That lesson was more valuable than the medical treatment itself." A relationship, a genuine friendship, began to form across the chasm of their pasts. He taught her a few words of Japanese. She told him about California. The enemy and the caregiver slowly faded away, leaving only a man and a woman working together to rebuild a broken life. Eventually, the time came for the prisoners to be moved. The war was ending, and they were to be repatriated to a devastated Japan. An unexpected anxiety settled over the ward. The outside world, once the only reality, now seemed like a frightening unknown. The hospital, with its clean sheets, its capable nurses, its predictable routines, had become a perverse kind of sanctuary. On his last day, Hiroshi Nakamura stood, his shoulder still stiff but functional. He sought out Lieutenant Collins. He bowed deeply, a formal, respectful bow from the waist. "Thank you," he said in careful, practiced English. "Thank you for my life." As she understood, she nodded, her professional composure for a moment softened by something deeper. "Take care of yourself, Private." He looked at her one last time, memorizing the face of the enemy who had shown him mercy, the woman who had been the instrument of his greatest psychological defeat and his most profound human revelation. He turned and walked away. Not back to the world he had known, but forward into a new one, a world whose boundaries had been irrevocably expanded by the power of an unexpected kindness. In the quiet, life-saving moments of that hospital on Guam, when gentle hands changed bandages and cool cloths, soothed fevers, the abstract concepts of enemy and ally dissolved. The Japanese prisoners, conditioned for hatred and a glorious death, were disarmed by a compassion they could not comprehend. And the American nurses, who had every reason to hate, chose instead to heal. They proved, in the most visceral way possible, that the most decisive weapon in any conflict is not the power to destroy, but the courage to care, and that the ultimate victory is not over an enemy, but over the darkness within ourselves. The seeds of a future peace were planted not in treaty halls, but in the silent, sacred space between a nurse's hand and a soldier's brow.